Welcome to Sleep Library, where we tell quiet stories for curious minds that need a little rest. Tonight, we're going to drift into something curious, a little strange, and just slow enough to help you forget about the day. Before we begin, if you'd like to help the library grow, you can gently tap subscribe, give this video a sleepy little like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. No pressure, just if it feels nice. Chapter 1. The Man Who Lived with Fear. Let's begin our quiet wandering through the winding halls of psychology. Not with a bang, but a whisper. Imagine, if you will, a man seated in a quiet room. There's nothing unusual about the space. Bare walls, a metal chair, perhaps a clipboard resting nearby. But this man is not at rest. He is in fact anticipating something. Not a great discovery or a sudden realization. No. He is waiting for a puff of air. And a rabbit. It was the early 20th century when John B. Watson and his colleague Rosalie Rayner conducted what came to be known as the Little Albert experiment. It sounds innocent at first. A child, a few toys, some furry animals. But this was no play date. It was, rather oddly, an attempt to condition fear. The subject was a baby, somewhere around 9 months old, who came to be known as Albert B. In the beginning, Albert was remarkably unfazed by most things. White rats? Not a flicker. Rabbits? Mild curiosity. Even a monkey elicited only a blink. But Watson, ever curious and unbothered by what we'd now call ethical constraints, had other plans. He paired the appearance of the white rat with a loud clanging sound. A steel bar struck just behind Albert's head. Over time, the poor child began to associate the soft, harmless rat with that jarring noise. The next time Albert saw the rat, he cried. He recoiled. His tiny body, still unsteady in the world, had learned fear. But that was only the beginning. Soon, Albert wasn't just afraid of rats. He was afraid of rabbits, of dogs, even of a Santa Claus mask with a white beard. In Watson's journal, this was labeled stimulus generalization. In simpler terms, the fear had spread. It's a peculiar thing, fear. It doesn't just live in the moment, it lingers, echoing softly through time. And in Albert's case, it grew roots in places where there should have only been wonder. The experiment itself was brief. Albert and his mother disappeared from public record shortly after. Some say she left intentionally, unwilling to continue the study. Others think the institution quietly ended the affair. Either way, the child faded back into the tapestry of ordinary life. His role in psychology sealed like a forgotten bookmark in a strange, unsettling chapter. Decades later, psychologists and historians tried to track down the real Albert. There were theories, even a few potential matches. One boy named Douglas Merritt was often cited as the most likely candidate. But the truth remains misty, like breath on a cold mirror. No definitive identity has ever been confirmed. Today, the Little Albert experiment is largely discussed with a kind of quiet unease. Not because of its findings, those were predictable, but because of its methods. There was no deconditioning phase, no effort made to remove the fear they had so carefully planted. Albert was taught fear, and then left with it, like an artist who paints a storm and then walks away. It raises soft questions, doesn't it, about curiosity and responsibility, about the ethics of exploration, when the map is drawn not on paper, but in someone's mind. We tend to imagine science as neutral, but psychology often treads through very human territory. Emotion, memory, habit, and when we touch those things, well, we bring our own fingerprints. Watson, for his part, moved on. He became an advertising executive, a curious pivot, though perhaps not so strange when you think about it. After all, if you know how to instill fear, you probably know how to sell soap. His theories found a new playground in the growing world of consumer culture. Conditioning, he believed, wasn't just a laboratory trick. It was a way of life. If you could pair emotion with a product, even subtly, you could shape desires the way he once shaped Albert's fears. There's a strange calm in all this if you look sideways at it. Not a happy calm perhaps, but a quiet one. Like watching the ripple of ideas move through time, soft and steady. The Little Albert study is often one of the first strange stories psychology students hear, nestled between more clinical models and brain diagrams. It remains not just a tale of early behavioralism, but a kind of bedtime fable, one with soft monsters and no clear ending. It reminds us gently that curiosity, while beautiful, must be carried carefully, especially when it walks through the minds of the vulnerable. One wonders, perhaps idly, whether Albert ever feared rats as an adult, or if the fear faded on its own, like fog lifting from a slow morning. We'll never know. The story doesn't tell us, and maybe that's for the best. The fire crackles, the night presses on, and deeper still, in the folds of sleep and study, stranger tales are waiting. Let's continue our journey. There's another room ahead. Chapter 2. A Man Named H.M. and the Puzzle of Memory. The story begins in quiet confusion. In the early 1950s, a man named Henry Gustav Mollison underwent a procedure that would quietly redefine how we understand memory. He wasn't famous. He didn't give lectures or write essays. In fact, for much of his life, Henry didn't even remember who he was speaking to. But in his silence and in the empty rooms of his remembering, he taught us more than he ever knew. Henry, known in the psychological literature simply as HM, suffered from debilitating seizures that began after a bicycle accident when he was a young boy. These seizures grew more frequent and more severe until doctors decided something had to be done. The proposed solution was, a little radical. A surgeon named William Scoville believed that the source of Henry's seizures lay deep within his brain, in a pair of structures called the medial temporal lobes, specifically the hippocampus. So, in 1953, Scoville removed them, both of them. It was one of the earliest forms of what would later be called a bilateral medial temporal lobectomy. The seizures, oddly enough, subsided. But something else went missing. After the operation, Henry was left with an extraordinary condition. He could remember his childhood and the broad strokes of life before the surgery. But from that moment on, his ability to form new long-term memories had vanished. He lived in a kind of permanent present. Conversations faded moments after they ended. Faces became unfamiliar within minutes. If someone left the room and returned, he often greeted them like a stranger. His memory span, they said, was about 20 seconds, give or take. And yet, he was polite, gentle, eager to engage in his own way. He would smile, he could solve puzzles, read magazines, even learn new motor skills, though he would never remember learning them. One of the most curious aspects of Henry's condition was that, Despite his amnesia, his procedural memory remained intact. That is to say, he could learn to draw a shape in a mirror, an awkward task requiring some practice. And with each session, he got better. But each time, he insisted he had never done it before. It was as though one part of his mind learned in secret, while another floated along, unaware and unanchored. Psychologists were fascinated. Researchers, most notably Brenda Milner, began studying Henry in depth. Day after day they spoke with him, tested him, asked the same questions, again and again, always receiving the same puzzled smile. From Henry's quiet presence, something monumental emerged. The understanding that memory is not one thing, but many. There are memories for facts and events, what we call declarative memory. There are memories for skills and actions, procedural memory, and they are stored in different regions of the brain. Henry's case showed this with the calm clarity of a night sky. One system was gone. The other remained. He never complained, at least not often. He knew something was different, but he didn't seem distressed. Perhaps the kindness of those around him helped, or perhaps the edges of confusion were softened by their own forgetfulness. Time was gentler when it did not accumulate. He became, in a way, the most studied patient in medical history. Hundreds of papers were written about him. Yet he was always referred to simply as HM, a gesture of privacy that only deepened the quiet mystery of his story. When he passed away in 2008, at the age of 82, his name was finally revealed. Henry Molaison. And then, in a gesture both scientific and strangely poetic, his brain was preserved and sliced into 2,401 thin sections, digitally mapped and made into a kind of three-dimensional atlas. Even in death he continued to teach. There's something remarkably gentle about Henry's story. It lacks the sharp corners we often expect from science. There is no villain here, no race against time. Just a man who lived in moments, and a world that quietly studied those moments one by one. If memory is the thread that stitches our lives together, Henry showed us what happens when the thread is cut. Not sharply, but softly. The past becomes a fog, the future a question mark. Only the present, quiet and flickering, remains. It's said that each time someone spoke with Henry, they introduced themselves Ogandine. 100 conversations, 1,000 beginnings, and yet he smiled each time, as if the world were always new, as if every hello was the first. Perhaps there's something to be admired in that, to live perpetually in the now. No baggage, no regrets, just the soft rhythm of repeating days. The field of neuroscience owes much to him, but more than that, he reminds us quietly, persistently, that who we are is held not just in our bones and blood, but in our memories. And when those go missing, the person remains. Changed, yes, but still human, still reaching for connection. And so Henry rests now, not just in memory, but in the study of memory. His story, like a candle in the dark, burns gently on. Not bright, not loud, just enough to see the edges of something vast. We'll leave his room now. Let the door close softly behind us. There's another hall ahead, another chapter, waiting in the shadows. Chapter 3. The Man Who Thought He Was Dead. In the soft shadows of psychological study, there are cases so quiet, so strange. They seem almost like fables. One such story comes from a hospital room in Scotland, where a man named Graham sat in calm certainty, convinced of something quite final. Graham believed he was dead. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, fully, literally dead. He said his brain had stopped working, that he no longer existed in the usual sense. His condition is known, at least in modern psychological literature, as Cotard's delusion, sometimes called walking corpse syndrome, and in Graham's case, it unfolded like a fog rolling slowly in. It began, as many strange stories do, after a period of deep depression. Graham had tried to take his own life by running an electric appliance while in the bath. He survived, but something shifted. Gradually, and then with absolute conviction, he began to insist that he had destroyed his brain in the process, that there was nothing left inside his skull. He stopped eating. He saw no point in hygiene. After all, if he was dead, what use was food or shampoo? Doctors were puzzled. He didn't hallucinate. He wasn't paranoid. His speech was clear, and his logic, at least within his belief system, was eerily consistent. He didn't claim to be a ghost, or a spirit, or anything supernatural, just a dead man in a living body. One might think such a condition would come with panic or distress, but Graham was calm, soft-spoken, at times even a little bored. There was no drama in his assertion, just a steady, unnerving confidence. Neuroscientists eventually performed a PET scan, an imaging test that measures activity in the brain. What they found was peculiar. Parts of Graham's brain showed patterns more often associated with comatose states than waking life, particularly in regions involved in self-awareness and emotional processing. In other words, his brain wasn't fully offline, but it was operating in a dim, flickering mode, like lights left on in an abandoned house. It's easy to be spooked by this if one lets the mind wander too far. The idea of a living person whose own brain tells them they no longer exist. But Cotard's delusion isn't entirely rare. There have been others. People who claimed their blood had dried up, or that their organs had vanished, or that they had rotted from the inside. Often, these beliefs are tied to neurological damage, or deep depressive episodes where emotional numbness takes on a strange, physical logic. I feel nothing, they think. Therefore, I must be nothing. It's a melancholy illusion, and yet, within it, a strange peace sometimes settles. Not joy, but a quiet stillness, like a person watching their own life from a distance, unable to reach through the glass. In Graham's case, therapy was slow and delicate. The goal wasn't to argue. After all, logic wasn't the problem. It was to gently reintroduce the idea of being alive, to rebuild the fragile connections between sensation and belief. And slowly, it worked. Years later, Graham began to accept that perhaps he wasn't dead. Not entirely. He began eating again. He resumed small routines. The fog lifted, not all at once, but in soft, tentative patches, like dawn filtering into a long, windowless night. He once described his recovery as boring, an odd word, but maybe fitting. There was no dramatic revelation, no great thunderclap, just the steady return of color to a grey world. Psychologists still study cases like his, tracing the strange paths the mind can walk when certain lights go dim. They speak softly about delusions of nihilism, about the loss of internal narrative. But underneath all the medical terms lies a more human truth. That identity, that feeling of being alive, is something we build every day, piece by gentle piece. And sometimes, if enough pieces slip, we forget the shape of the whole. It's an unsettling idea, but not an entirely dark one, because just as the mind can lose its way, it can also, slowly, find its path again. There is something quietly hopeful in that, like moss returning to stone. There's a peculiar comfort in hearing about Graham, sitting in his chair, drinking tea, perhaps looking out a window with no particular urgency. A man who once believed himself to be a corpse, now wondering what to have for lunch. There's no moral here, no grand conclusion. Just a soft reminder that the mind is a curious thing, capable of great logic and strange illusions, of poetry and silence, of forgetting that it is alive, and then, sometimes, remembering again. Let's leave Graham there, content in his quiet, not quite afterlife. We'll tiptoe into the next chapter. The hall is long, but there are more rooms ahead. Chapter 4. The sleepy village that forgot to sleep. Nestled in the green folds of Kazakhstan's countryside, far from the restless churn of cities, lies a place once known only to maps and passing shepherds. A village so small and still, it barely whispered into the world. Its name is Kalachi, a sleepy village in every sense, though not in the way one might expect. For a time, Kalachi became famous not for what its residents did while awake, but for what they could not help doing, falling asleep. It started slowly, with just a few people nodding off at odd hours. A farmer, sitting down for lunch, slumping into his bowl. A schoolchild, face drooping gently into her textbook. A grandmother, mid-sentence, drifting away mid-thought. But soon the pattern grew. Men would fall asleep in the fields. Women would nod off while cooking. Entire classrooms paused mid-lesson as heads tipped forward like flowers folding at dusk. Some slept for hours, others for days. And when they woke, they were dazed, boggy, unsure of where the time had gone. Doctors came, scientists, journalists, all armed with questions. Was it something in the air? In the water? Was this some new sleep disorder? Or something stranger still? The villagers themselves were remarkably calm. Sleep was not after all a frightening thing, just inconvenient. Some even laughed about it. "We are just the dreamiest people in Kazakhstan," one local said with a tired smile. But others were less amused, especially those who fell asleep while driving tractors, or carrying children, or lighting stoves. Some suffered hallucinations upon waking. Others experienced memory loss. A few were so disoriented they believed they had died and returned again. The scientists called it pathological somnolence. The villagers simply called it the sleep. Researchers took samples of soil and hair and blood. They monitored carbon monoxide levels, looked for pesticides, examined histories of the land. For a time, suspicion fell upon a nearby abandoned uranium mine, left to the quiet hum of disuse since the days of the Soviet Union. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. The mine had flooded, releasing radon gas or other toxins that drifted invisibly through the village, disrupting neural function. But no definitive cause was ever confirmed. The villagers continued to drift in and out of slumber, like leaves on a still pond. There is something oddly poetic about an entire community afflicted by too much sleep. In a world driven by noise, urgency, and ceaseless clocks, Kalachi moved to a different rhythm, a softer one. Though the sleep disrupted lives, it also introduced a kind of shared surrender. A village that napped together, laughed together, puzzled quietly together. When asked how it felt, many said the same thing. It was like falling through cotton, like slipping down into a place where time had no edges. Some remembered vivid dreams. Others remembered nothing at all. The line between waking and sleeping blurred until it barely seemed to matter. Eventually, some of the villagers were relocated. The government offered compensation for those who wished to leave. But many stayed. Kalachi was their home after all. And sleep, however strange, was not enough to drive them out. The sleep epidemic, as some called it, faded with time. Fewer people began experiencing it. The cause, if there ever was one, remained elusive, like a shadow seen only out of the corner of one's eye. But the village remained quiet. Even now, if you walk through its narrow streets, you'll see shuttered windows and the soft drift of smoke from chimneys. Cats sun themselves on fences. Children play slowly, unhurried. And sometimes, people still nap in the afternoon, just in case. Kalachi, they say, has returned to normal. But normal is a curious word. In a village where dreams once swept people away in daylight, normal is perhaps just another kind of mystery. Sleep, after all, is still one of the most peculiar things we do. We close our eyes, surrender consciousness, and drift into a state where reason is suspended. Time dissolves, and our minds perform strange theatre behind the curtains of the skull. It happens to everyone. Kings and cab drivers, astronauts and accountants, and yet we still don't fully understand it. Why do we dream? Why do some remember nothing, and others remember entire worlds? What, precisely, is the function of REM sleep? There are answers, of course, chemical, neurological, evolutionary, but none of them feel quite complete. None of them explain the feeling of sleep. Kalachi, in its strange way, offered a glimpse into that mystery, a population touched by something that pulled them into the realm of dreams without warning. It was both frightening and strangely beautiful. Some locals began keeping dream journals, noting odd coincidences, shared imagery, recurring symbols, a dog with two tails, a house filled with clocks, a woman who spoke in riddles. Was it coincidence? Collective unconscious. The fertile imaginings of people looking for meaning. Or perhaps just dreams. Strange floating things that slip away upon waking, like footprints in snow. And what if the sleep wasn't a disease at all? What if it was a message, or a reminder? A whisper from the earth, telling its children to rest. That idea, of course, is not scientific, but it's soft and a little beautiful. Now and then, even years later, visitors still come to Kalachi. Curious wanderers, journalists, researchers with portable EEG machines. They walk through the quiet streets looking for clues, and sometimes wonder if they too might be caught by the sleep. But most simply stay for tea, listen to the wind, maybe sit for a moment on a bench and feel the afternoon sun. And once in a while, if the air is just right and the shadows are long, they might feel their eyelids grow heavy. Not from boredom, not from fatigue, just a gentle invitation. And so we leave Kalachi behind, not with answers, but with a soft yawn. Let's continue forward, slowly. There are more odd rooms in the Museum of the Mind, some lit brightly, others softly dimmed. Let's find another. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Couldn't Feel Pain. In a small town in Scotland, beneath skies often wrapped in soft grey cloud, lives a woman who does not hurt. Not because she is cold or indifferent, not because she is invincible, but because, quite simply, she was born that way. Her name is Jo Cameron, and for most of her life, she didn't realize there was anything unusual about her. Pain, as a concept, was something others seemed to talk about more than she could relate to. Paper cuts were curious. Burns were mildly inconvenient. Dental surgery, barely worth mentioning. She once leaned against a hot stove and smelled her own skin before realizing it was burning. She has broken bones without flinching. She gave birth twice with what she described as a ticklish discomfort. When she had surgery on her hand, she declined painkillers, not out of bravery, but because she simply didn't feel the need. For decades, no one believed her. She was often told she had a high pain tolerance, or perhaps that she was exaggerating her calm. But eventually, scientists took notice. Geneticists at University College London began to study her case, and what they found nestled quietly in her DNA was something quite unexpected. Jo carries a rare genetic mutation, a deletion in a previously unknown gene the researchers dubbed FR out, located near a more familiar one known as FR, short for fatty acid amide hydrolase. This FAH gene helps regulate levels of a neurotransmitter involved in pain sensation, mood, and memory. In most people, it acts like a kind of biochemical traffic cop, keeping discomfort in line. But in Jo, the system behaves differently. Her body floods with natural anandamide, a cannabinoid, not unlike the active ingredients in cannabis. This chemical dulls pain, lifts mood, and softens fear. And so, Jo lives in a state that borders on bliss. She rarely feels anxiety. Her wounds heal faster than usual. Her memory for unpleasant experiences is hazy. Her emotional baseline, she says, is somewhere around content. Scientists are fascinated. Philosophers too. Because Jo's case opens up soft and strange questions about how pain shapes our lives. What would it mean to live without it? What would we lose if suffering was only a rumor? Pain, for most of us, is not merely a nuisance. It is a teacher, a guardrail. It keeps us from walking on broken ankles or reaching into flames. It gives shape to our memories, makes certain moments sharper, heavier, more real. Pain binds us to others. When we say we hurt, we are often saying, I am human. I need comfort. Please understand. But Jo's life suggests a parallel reality, one where pain is not the primary guide. She moves through life like someone reading a book, without the sharpness of punctuation. The sentences are still there, but they feel softer. She once told an interviewer that she doesn't understand fear the way others do. She recalls walking into a traffic incident without thinking to check for danger. She doesn't worry about the future. Bad news, she says, doesn't stick. Her condition, in some ways, seems enviable, a life without pain or dread, but it also carries its own peculiar weight. Without pain, one must learn caution as a concept, not as a reaction. Jo has had to teach herself to scan her body visually for cuts or bruises she might not feel. She examines her hands for burns, her feet for swelling. Pain, absent its warning bells, becomes a matter of logic, a checklist, an act of observation. And then there's the oddity of happiness. Because Jo doesn't just lack pain, she also feels unusually good. Her natural chemistry creates a persistent sense of well-being, not giddiness, not mania, just a quiet, floating ease. Some researchers call her biology a natural blueprint for anxiety relief. There are whispers about new drugs inspired by her genetics, treatments that could mimic her condition. One wonders what a world full of Joe Camerons might look like. Quieter, perhaps, or stranger. Yet Jo herself is not a product or a prototype, she's a person. One who enjoys gardening and spending time with her family. Who reads crime novels without wincing at the injuries within. Who still marvels gently at the idea that others experience life so differently. She says she's always found people's reactions to stubbed toes, or paper cuts a bit. Dramatic, not in a mean-spirited way, just puzzling. Why all the fuss? And in return, many people find her just as puzzling. A woman who lives without what most of us consider an essential feature of being alive. But perhaps that's where the beauty lies, in the variety of human experience, in the way that biology writes different poems for each of us. Some with pain, some without, some with songs we cannot hear, and others we cannot stop singing. Jo's story is not one of triumph or tragedy. It's not even really a story of survival. It's a story of sensation, of absence, of gentle bewilderment. A life defined not by what it endures, but by what it quietly lacks. There are no alarms ringing in Jo's nervous system. No sharp edges to her day. Just a steady drift through a world that feels less jagged, more like water than stone. And so we leave her there, among her flowers, tending to a garden that may prick and sting, though she would never know it. A woman who walks barefoot across the gravel and feels, perhaps, only the idea of texture. We move on now softly. The next door creaks open, and another peculiar mind waits within. Chapter 6. The twins who shared a mind. There is something already slightly mysterious about twins. They appear in stories and myths with a shimmer of otherness. Two people born together, often finishing each other's sentences, sensing each other's moods, reflecting the world back in double. But among the most curious twins ever recorded in the long drowsy annals of psychology were two sisters from Wales, Jennifer and June Gibbons. Born in 1963 to Barbadian parents and raised in the quiet town of Haverfordwest, the Gibbons twins did not speak to anyone but each other. Not truly, not deeply, and not for years. They had a language of their own, a kind of rapid-fire whispering that no one else could understand. Observers described it as melodic, hypnotic, and often completely unintelligible. Even tape recorders struggled to capture its rhythm. At school they sat in silence. At home they retreated into their room. Their parents were gentle, worried, puzzled. Teachers tried coaxing. Doctors tried testing. But the girls remained wrapped in a shared silence that seemed impermeable. They became known as the Silent Twins. But their silence wasn't empty. Behind their quiet eyes and closed mouths, Jennifer and June built entire worlds. They wrote stories, hundreds of them, filled with peculiar characters, romantic entanglements, betrayals, and deaths. Their favorite themes involved crime and obsession, darkness with a hint of melodrama. The writing, much of it done in spiral notebooks or on a typewriter, was hauntingly vivid, some of it even published. They made dolls, named them, gave them elaborate biographies. Their bedroom became a kind of miniature world, a private nation built for two. They mirrored each other's movements almost perfectly. If one twin laughed, the other did too. If one walked faster, the other adjusted. They seemed to breathe in sync. But this closeness came with a weight, a heaviness. Their relationship, according to diaries later discovered, was not one of easy affection. It was obsessive, compulsive, at times frightening. Each girl recorded thoughts about the other that swung from love to resentment and back again. They were both comforted and suffocated by their bond. In their late teens, their behavior shifted. They began committing small crimes, vandalism, shoplifting, arson. The flames they set were real, though the reasons behind them flickered more vaguely. It was not malice, not greed, something else, perhaps a cry, perhaps an experiment. They were arrested and soon after institutionalized at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in England. There, the silence continued. They were diagnosed with psychopathic disorder, though some questioned the label. Were they dangerous or just deeply misunderstood? Inside Broadmoor, their behavior remained mysterious. They kept to themselves, maintained their rituals, shared long mirror-like silences. Nurses and doctors watched in fascination. The twins weren't violent. They were just locked in a world where the door had no key. Journalist Marjorie Wallace took an interest in their case. She visited again and again, slowly earning their trust. Over time, she was allowed glimpses into their writing, their diaries, their strange twinly mythology. What she found was remarkable. Two young women deeply aware of their condition, profoundly articulate on paper, and yet unable or unwilling to break their pact of silence. And there was something else, an idea that crept quietly through their writings, a belief, especially from Jennifer, that one of them would have to die for the other to truly live. It is a chilling notion, but one that repeats in their journals. Jennifer often wrote about being possessed, about being the shadow twin. June, in turn, wrote about her sister as both protector and jailer. The emotional entanglement had become, by their own admission, unbearable. Then, in 1993, something strange happened. The twins were being considered for transfer to a lower security hospital. They were to be given a chance at last to live somewhat normal lives. During transport, Jennifer began to feel unwell. She slumped forward. Her speech slowed. Her pulse weakened. She died shortly after arrival. The cause, acute myocarditis, a sudden inflammation of the heart. No poison, no trauma, no warning. Doctors were baffled. June, for her part, emerged from the tragedy. Transformed. She began to speak, slowly at first, then more fluently. She took interest in the outside world, spoke to the press, published some of their joint writings. When asked about her sister's death, she said it was meant to be, that they had made a pact, that Jennifer had given her life so that June could be free. And in a way, it seemed true. June went on to live quietly in Wales. She worked, she made friends. She lived modestly, but openly. Jennifer, buried in a small grave with a headstone reading, "We once were two, we two made one," became a part of the strange folklore of psychology. A real person, yes, but also a symbol of enmeshment, of silent bonds, of how deep the mind can fold in on itself when shared too completely with another. To this day, the Gibbons twins remain a source of fascination. Were they an example of folie à deux, a shared delusion between two minds? Or were they simply too close, too synchronized, for the world to pass? They broke the usual categories. They defied the standard terms. There is no easy explanation, only a sense of wonder and mild sadness. They remind us, perhaps, of the fragile architecture of identity, that we are shaped not just by our own thoughts, but by the reflections of those closest to us. That in some rare cases, those reflections become mirrors with no end. And in those mirrors, one can be both seen and lost. Let's walk on now. Let the pages turn quietly. Another story waits ahead, under softer lights, behind another door. Chapter 7. The Volunteers Who Sat in Darkness. In a quiet research facility buried beneath the French Alps, far from the chatter of city life or the tick of public clocks, a man named Michel Siffre climbed into a cave and chose to stay there for 2 months. He was not escaping, nor hiding. He was conducting an experiment, not on light or sound or movement, but on time itself. Michel was a geologist by training, but his curiosity reached beyond rocks and strata. He wanted to understand what would happen to the human brain when completely divorced from natural rhythms. No sun, no moon, no clocks, no calendars, just darkness, solitude, and the slow drift of seconds into minutes, minutes into hours. It was 1962 when he descended into the cave, a glacial hollow known as the Scarasson Abyss. He brought with him food, water, reading materials, scientific equipment, and a small communication system that allowed him to speak with a team above ground, though they were forbidden from telling him the time. For all practical purposes, Michel had stepped outside of the human calendar. The cave was cold and damp. The air was heavy. Days passed, or seemed to. He slept when he was tired, woke when he was rested, ate when hungry. Over time, his sense of time began to drift, subtly, then dramatically. At one point, convinced it was mid-afternoon, he called his team only to be told that it was, in fact, the middle of the night. His internal rhythms had begun to free-float, untethered by sunrises and sunsets. What we call circadian rhythm was no longer aligned with anything measurable. Michel began sleeping in cycles that lasted more than 24 hours, sometimes 36, sometimes 48. His sense of days evaporated. When he finally emerged, blinking into daylight after 63 days, he believed he had only been underground for 35. It was as though, in the absence of time, the mind folded inward, collapsing the usual markers of memory and motion. The experiment was repeated many times over the following decades, not just by Siffre himself, but by other volunteers. Some stayed underground for 3 months, some longer, always with the same goal: to observe what happens when time is erased. What they found, quietly and consistently, was this: the human mind does not need the sun to function, but it begins to lose its shape without it. Sleep becomes irregular, memory thins, emotions flatten. Some volunteers reported deep calm, others found themselves floating in a fog of indifference. A few experienced mild hallucinations, a voice in the cave, a shadow moving where no shadow should be. And yet none of them panicked. The darkness after a while became familiar, even comforting. One participant described it as a womb made of stone. In one of the more recent experiments, a group of 15 volunteers entered a similar cave system in the Ariège region of southern France. They stayed for 40 days with no clocks, no sunlight, no external communication. When they emerged, they were amazed to discover how little time they thought had passed. Some guessed 25 days, others even less. They had adjusted to a new rhythm, a rhythm driven not by the turning of the earth, but by the slow interior pulse of their own bodies. And in those caves, time slowed, or stretched, or curled. These experiments have offered science important insights into chronobiology, the study of biological rhythms. We've learned that our internal clocks are flexible, that the human body maintains a rough 24-hour cycle even in isolation, but not precisely. Without external cues, we drift. Some become night people, some become perpetual nappers. Time, it seems, is more subjective than we like to admit. But beyond the science, these experiments offer something stranger, something more poetic. What is time after all when we are not watching the clock? When no appointments or alarms push us forward? When there is no Monday, no weekend, no birthday? When we wake not because we must, but because our body simply decides to stir? In those caves, stripped of time, people found themselves thinking differently, writing more, reflecting. Some reported moments of deep, unstructured thought, where ideas floated, slow and unhurried, unshaped by urgency. There is a quiet metaphor here, perhaps, about modern life, about how much of our stress, our exhaustion, comes not from action itself, but from its pace, its scheduling, its relentless ticking. To live in a cave without time is not sustainable, of course. Most volunteers emerge blinking, dazed, grateful to see the sun. They return to clocks and calendars, meetings and meal times. But something lingered. A softness. A sense that time is not a river, but a fog. Something we move through, shaping it as much as it shapes us. Michel Siffry, now an old man, still reflects on those early experiments. He spent months of his life beneath the earth, in silence, in darkness, in his own head. And yet, he calls those times peaceful. He says he never felt alone, only unmeasured. There's something comforting in that idea. That time, like sleep, like thought, is pliable. That when stripped of its numbers, its bells and buzzers, it becomes something closer to a mood, a space, a breath. The cave, for all its isolation, becomes a kind of mirror, not just for the mind, but for how we construct meaning. We talk about wasting time, or killing time, or running out of time. But in the cave, none of these make sense. There is only the next moment, and the one after, and the slow rhythm of breathing. It is perhaps the closest we can come to touching stillness. Not the absence of motion, but the absence of expectation. And so we leave the caves now, climb gently back into the light. Let our eyes adjust. Let the clocks tick again. The next story is waiting. It will come, like the others, in its own time. Chapter 8. The Girl Who Remembered Everything. In a quiet suburb of Southern California, a woman named Jill Price lives with a mind unlike almost anyone else on earth. Her memory is vast, not in the way of a scholar who has memorized books, or a performer who recites Shakespeare from heart, in a more peculiar, deeply personal way. Jill remembers everything she has ever lived. Ask her what happened on March 7, 1986, and she can tell you, not just headlines or generalities, but her breakfast, her outfit, the weather, what was on TV, the argument she had with her mother, the number of steps she walked in the morning, and how she felt about the entire thing. This condition is called highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM. And when scientists first discovered it in the early 2000s, they were skeptical. At first, Jill, known in the research literature as Patient AJ, was simply thought to have an exceptional recall. But tests, long and strange and filled with forgotten trivia, proved otherwise. She wasn't just good at remembering, her memories were like a film archive, meticulously indexed by date and emotion, ready to be played back with uncanny clarity. She knew, for example, which day of the week each date fell on, decades back. She could recall what she was doing when particular episodes of television aired. She did not forget. Not birthdays, not slights, not failures, not joys. At first, this might seem like a gift. Who wouldn't want to remember every vacation, every compliment, every beautiful sunset? But Jill describes it more like a burden. Her memory is not selective. It does not prioritize. It does not fade. Every awkward moment, every painful loss, every insult from junior high, still present, still fresh. She calls it a kind of non-stop, uncontrollable, and totally exhausting experience. Most people's memories work like sand, grainy, partial, eroded by time. But Jill's are more like polished stones, still smooth, still sharp. She didn't study to remember. She never trained her brain. It simply happened. Around age 11, her memories began anchoring themselves more forcefully. And from that point forward, her life became a living timeline. Scientists at UC Irvine spent years studying her brain. They used MRI scans, interviews, tests, and endless lists of random dates. And what they discovered was that people with HSAM seem to have certain differences in areas of the brain associated with autobiographical memory, such as the temporal lobe and the caudate nucleus, the latter being involved in habit and skill learning, as well as obsessive behaviors. Many people with HSAM also report a tendency to collect things, to organize intensely, to categorize and record. Their minds are like vast attics, with everything sorted, boxed, and labeled, except the boxes are always open, and the contents sometimes spill into the present. One of the more curious elements of HSAM is that it doesn't make people better at everything. Most people with the condition aren't brilliant at mathematics, or music, or even learning languages. Their memory is specific, limited to the events of their own lives. They remember what happened to them, not necessarily everything they've read or seen. And they don't always want to. Jill has said that it's difficult to let go of the past when the past never leaves. When memories of embarrassment or grief surface with the same clarity as moments of celebration, the emotional weight can accumulate. Imagine feeling every day the sting of an old wound as if it had just occurred. Most of us are gently protected by the erosion of time. We forget the sting of a childhood insult. We misremember the awkwardness of a breakup. We let time soften and blur the edges. But Jill remembers, and the clarity, while impressive, can be overwhelming. Still, there is comfort in routine, she says. In rewatching familiar shows, in organizing, in the structure of daily life. These things create anchors, small tethers to hold memory in place. Researchers have since found a handful of other people with HSAM. each with their own flavor of memory. Some are more visual, others emotional. Some experience memories like flashbacks, others as simple, constant knowing. In interviews, many express similar challenges. Their memories are deeply personal, often isolating. It is hard to connect with people who do not remember in the same way, and hard to explain how something from 20 years ago still feels present, not metaphorically, but literally. Yet, there's a quiet beauty to their stories too. Imagine remembering every birthday card ever given to you, every rainstorm you've watched from a window, every song that made you weep, the sound of your grandmother's voice, the exact pitch, the way she said your name. There's something gently poetic in the idea that, for some, memory does not decay. It simply gathers. A lifetime as a bookshelf that never runs out of space. But even the best shelves can sag. Even the most treasured keepsakes grow heavy with time. And so, for Jill and those like her, life is a constant act of management, of living not only in the present, but alongside every version of themselves they've ever been. It raises questions softly about what memory is for. Is it meant to guide, to teach, or is it meant to fade, to loosen its grip so that we might be free to start again? We do not know. But Jill's story reminds us that forgetting is not always a flaw. It is a kind of mercy, a gentle letting go, a way to soften the edges of our stories so we may rest within them. And for those who cannot forget, life is both deeper and more difficult. The past is not a shadow behind them. It walks beside them, always. Let's move on now, gently. Another story is waiting, half remembered in the quiet halls of the strange and dreaming mind. Chapter 9. The Boy Raised Without Touch. In the softly faded photographs of early 20th century orphanages, one can see rows of cribs lined up in near-perfect formation. Small iron beds, each with a pillow, a blanket, and a child staring upward. What's missing from these images is not food or shelter, but something harder to see: touch. In the years following World War I, researchers in the United States and Europe began to notice something unsettling in these institutions. The children were fed, clothed, and kept in relatively clean conditions. And yet, they weren't thriving. Many were dying. Not from illness, not from malnutrition, but from something quieter. The condition came to be known in medical records as failure to thrive. And one of the earliest researchers to explore it was Dr. Harry Harlow, though the path he walked would be winding, controversial, and deeply strange. Harlow worked with rhesus monkeys. He was interested in the nature of affection, what it meant, what it did, and whether it was truly necessary. At the time, the prevailing belief in American psychology, especially among behaviorists, was that affection was unnecessary, a distraction even. Love, they said, was not need, but a luxury. So Harlow sets out to test this. In one of his most famous, and most debated, experiments, he separated infant monkeys from their biological mothers and placed them in cages with two surrogate figures. One was made of wire and offered food. The other was covered in soft cloth, but had no food to give. What he found was quietly radical. The monkeys clung to the cloth mother, sometimes for 22 hours a day, returning to the wire mother only briefly to feed. They nestled, buried their faces, and showed signs of emotional comfort. When frightened, They ran not to the source of food, but to the source of softness. Love, it seemed, was not optional. It was elemental. This simple discovery shifted the conversation around human development. Suddenly, the idea that children only needed food and shelter seemed hollow. They needed comfort, connection, skin on skin. Further studies, some more ethically complicated, showed what happened when monkeys were raised in total isolation. The results were harrowing. Without touch or social interaction, they became withdrawn, anxious, sometimes violent. Some refused to eat. Others rocked endlessly, self-soothing in the absence of contact. The damage was not just emotional, it was structural. Their brains, it turned out, were different. Harlow's work was groundbreaking, but also haunting. He did not shy away from the darkness. In fact, he named his devices with almost theatrical morbidity. One of his isolation chambers was called the Pit of Despair. His writings were unflinching. Some called them cruel, others called them brave. All agreed they were unforgettable. But even before Harlow, the importance of touch had whispered through the annals of medical history. In 13th century Sicily, Emperor Frederick II conducted an experiment that sounds more like a fable than a study. He wanted to discover the natural language of humanity, the language that children would speak if never exposed to speech. So he ordered that a group of infants be raised in complete silence. Nurses could feed and bathe them, but they could not speak, cuddle, or comfort. The children, according to legend, all died. There is no conclusive record of this study, but the idea it planted remains, that without touch, without human warmth, something essential fails to form. In more modern times, studies have shown that premature babies who receive regular skin-to-skin contact, what's now called kangaroo care, have better health outcomes. They gain weight faster, cry less, and form stronger bonds with caregivers. And it's not just about babies. Touch continues to play a role throughout our lives. It lowers cortisol, slows the heart rate, strengthens the immune system. Even brief intentional touch, a hand on the shoulder, a gentle pat on the back, can shift our mood. We are built to respond to contact. But the most haunting stories are the ones where touch is absent. There are accounts from post-Soviet orphanages where rows of children lay in near silence, rarely crying, not because they were content, but because they had learned that crying brought nothing. No comfort, no arms, just emptiness. Some of these children, when later adopted, struggled to form attachments. They flinched at affection, or clung too tightly. The patterns varied, but the root was often the same: a developmental world built without touch. The brain, especially in childhood, grows in response to experience. Neural pathways bloom like wildflowers when nurtured. But when deprived of contact, of comfort, they falter. In adulthood, the legacy of early deprivation can echo softly. People may fear intimacy without knowing why, or seek it too urgently, as if trying to fill a space they never understood. Yet even here, there is hope. Studies have shown that the brain remains malleable, that people who experience deprivation can, with care and time, form healthy relationships. Therapy helps, so does patience, and so, of course, does touch. The most surprising part is that even imagined touch can offer some benefit. Studies using virtual reality or even mental exercises have shown changes in mood and stress levels. The mind, it seems, responds to the idea of connection almost as powerfully as the connection itself. In this way, we are not just physical beings, but deeply metaphorical ones. We crave nearness, even in metaphor. The boy raised without touch is not just a story from a lab. He's a symbol, a reminder of what happens when the invisible threads of care and contact are cut. And it calls us back to something very old, that affection is not decoration, it is infrastructure, that without it, the body may survive, but the self does not quite bloom. So, as we drift through these soft chapters of psychological curiosity, this one stands out not for its strangeness, but for its truth. Touch matters. Even now, wherever you are, perhaps curled beneath a blanket, or tucked into bed, the warmth you feel from a pet, a partner, the memory of a parent's embrace is part of your health, your memory, your being. It is a language older than words. And so we move forward, now a little quieter. The next story waits, tucked gently between neurons and narratives, in the soft folds of the sleeping mind. Chapter 10. The Man Who Made Up the World. In a sunlit office in Boston, in the early years of the 20th century, a man named Henry Head, a neurologist with the name of a detective and the gaze of a poet, sat quietly, watching another man describe a map that did not exist. The man speaking, a patient under his care, had suffered a stroke some months prior. Since then, he could no longer read or write, could not recognize familiar faces, and often failed to name common objects. And yet, he believed he was living in a house he did not own, on a street that had no name, next to people who were no longer alive. What Dr. Head had stumbled upon, what he and others would come to study over decades, was not madness, but something softer and stranger, a neurological phenomenon known as confabulation. To confabulate is not to lie, it is to remember, with conviction, things that never happened, to fill in the gaps of memory with invented, yet entirely sincere, stories. These inventions are not wild or grand, no tales of alien abduction or time travel. They are plausible, often mundane. My wife just stepped out to get groceries, said by a man whose wife died 10 years earlier. Or I'm waiting for my students, uttered by a retired professor, sitting alone in a hospital gown. The brain, when injured or impaired, particularly in areas responsible for memory like the prefrontal cortex or thalamus, often reaches inward, tugging at the frayed threads of recollection. Where a hole exists, it gently patches it with narrative. The result is a seamless story, stitched together with fragments both real and imagined. For the patient, the story feels true, entirely. There is no deceit, no performance, just a quiet confidence that the world they describe is, in fact, the world that exists. And perhaps for them, it is. Some of the most well-known cases come from individuals with Korsakoff's syndrome, a memory disorder often linked to chronic alcohol abuse, and thiamine deficiency. Patients can lose their ability to form new memories, living in a kind of eternal present, but they fill the space with explanation. If you ask them why they are in a hospital, they may say, "I'm waiting for a train." If you ask what day it is, they may answer with the certainty of someone who checked the calendar moments ago, though they haven't seen one in weeks. Their minds do not pause in confusion. They continue the story. Always. This impulse, this need to narrate, seems to be deeply human. It may be that the brain is not built simply to record facts, but to construct meaning. Memory, after all, is not a filing cabinet. It's a storytelling device. We don't remember everything. We remember what we can shape into narrative. And when the raw material runs out, we improvise. The world, in this light, becomes a kind of soft fiction, one that we tell ourselves with conviction, whether or not it's true. Some confabulators create elaborate personal geographies. One man believed his hospital room was actually a hotel in Paris. Another insisted his nurses were actors in a play, changing costumes when he wasn't looking. None of it malicious, none of it dramatic. Just soft invention, born of absence. The psychologist Oliver Sacks, who spent much of his life studying such patients, described one man who, after losing much of his memory, seemed to live in an endless present. He would listen politely, nod, and then immediately forget what had been said, but instead of panicking, he invented a continuous thread of context to keep himself grounded. Sacks called it narrative reflex, the brain's way of keeping the self afloat. And it's not only those with severe brain injuries who confabulate. In subtle ways, we all do it. When we recall a childhood memory, we often see ourselves from the outside, as if watching a film. Yet no one remembers their own face. We insert details we could not have seen. We soften harsh moments, or sharpen blurry ones. We misremember conversations, rearrange timelines, attribute thoughts to the wrong person. And yet, we rarely notice. Our minds are, in this way, kind curators, less concerned with accuracy than coherent. A story that makes sense, that feels emotionally true, is often more useful to us than one that is factually precise. This is why eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. Not because people lie, but because memory itself is a living document, revised with each telling, each rehearsal. We do not store memories like files on a hard drive. We reconstruct them every time. Which raises soft questions. What then is a true memory? And how do we know which ones to trust? Neuroscience offers no tidy answer, but it suggests that memory is less like a recording and more like a painting. Some strokes are bold, others faint. Some colors are accurate, others imagined. And all of it depends on the light in which we remember. For confabulators, the painting continues even when the canvas has holes. Their minds fill in the blanks with brushstrokes that feel familiar. Sometimes, these false memories become elaborate. A man might believe he has been recruited by the government. A woman might insist her room is a replica, not the real thing. These beliefs, while untrue, serve a quiet purpose. They reduce anxiety. They offer structure. They explain the inexplicable. Even in confusion, the mind wants order. There's something deeply human in this. We are meaning makers. We seek continuity. And when the world cracks, we narrate over the cracks, with stories, with metaphors, with memories that may never have occurred. And while this may sound like a flaw, it is also a feature. It allows us to live with loss, to survive trauma, to remember love more clearly than pain. It lets us believe that things made sense even when they didn't. The man who made up the world is not alone. He is all of us, in quiet degrees. We invent, we misremember, we rewrite, and in those rewritings we live. Now, as the mind begins to drift and the shadows lengthen across the quiet spaces of thought, let us rest a moment. This chapter, like the others, softens at the edges. No ending, just a gentle trailing off. Another page, perhaps, for another night. Chapter 11. The Man Who Disappeared into Himself. In the late 1980s, in the bustling, fluorescent quiet of a care home in Ontario, a man sat by a window and looked out at nothing in particular. His name was not remarkable. His records were slim. His conversations, when they occurred, were brief and clipped. But his mind, or rather what had happened inside it, was one of the most quietly bewildering events ever observed in the field of psychology. This was a man who, quite literally, had vanished into his own consciousness. He had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition known as auto-activation deficit, a close cousin of more widely known disorders like akinetic mutism or certain forms of frontal lobe damage. But the name, clinical and cool, doesn't quite describe the experience. What it meant simply was this: unless prompted, he did nothing, not in a lazy or willful way, but in a profound, bone-deep absence of initiative. He did not speak unless spoken to, did not move unless guided. Left alone, he would sit, sometimes for hours, still as a statue, with eyes open and breathing steady, completely awake, but doing nothing at all. Not asleep, not unconscious, simply paused. And yet, when prompted, by a question, by the gentle urging of a nurse, by the presence of another person, he would come to life. He could answer questions, he could walk, he could eat. But the moment the external stimulus stopped, the stillness returned. Doctors observed him with fascination. This was not depression or catatonia or willful resistance. There was no agitation, no sadness, no sign of delusion. He was, by all appearances, content, simply lacking the internal spark that tells a person, do something now. The frontal lobes of the brain are responsible for many things: decision-making, motivation, planning, impulse control. When they are damaged, the result can be chaotic, or, in cases like this, quietly erasing. It was as if the executive function of his mind had gone on an indefinite sabbatical. The neurologist Mario Mendez, who studied similar cases, described it like this: the internal engine of the self, the part that says get up, do this, say that, has shut down. What remains is a vessel without wind. In one of the more gently unsettling accounts, a patient with this condition was found standing by his bed in the morning, still in pajamas, unmoving. When asked why he hadn't gotten dressed, he replied simply, "No one told me to." These people were not incapable. Their motor skills remained. Their speech, their memory, their basic understanding of the world were intact. But the thread of will, the quiet inner voice that pushes us through each moment, had gone missing. It's a strange reminder of how much of our daily life is powered by invisible forces. We don't usually notice the voice that says, now rise, now shower, now go. But when it's gone, the difference is profound. Some of these patients responded to structured environments, routines, external prompts. It was as if the world had to substitute for their missing inner compass. One patient began to thrive in a highly regimented care home, where meals, activities, and personal care were scheduled down to the minute. When his caregivers gave him tasks and offered gentle nudges, he was responsive, engaged, but left alone, the stillness returned. There is something quietly eerie about this, but also deeply human. Because all of us, in quieter ways, rely on external structures. We depend on calendars, on social expectations, on the morning sun, and the sound of the kettle boiling. Without these cues, we drift. Auto-activation deficit is rare, yes, but it whispers something universal, that the self is not just a singular solid entity, but a process. A series of small nudges, both internal and external, that add up to what we call being alive. When those nudges are missing, even the simplest act becomes unreachable. And yet, these patients were not lost. They were reachable. With structure, with care, with gentle persistence, they could engage. It was not a matter of restoring memory or language, but of building scaffolding for the will to rest upon. One researcher described it this way: they are not sleeping, they are waiting. And there's a kind of melancholy beauty in that, because aren't we all at times waiting for a reason to begin again? These quiet cases serve not just as curiosities, but as reminders of how delicate the machinery of the mind is, of how motivation and action are not merely choices, but layered processes involving networks of neurons and pulses of chemistry. And that without those layers, we do not disappear. We simply stop. The man who disappeared into himself never screamed, never panicked. He simply waited for a voice, a prompt, a question. And when one came, he returned, briefly. There's something restful in that, something almost serene. Let us move now, slowly, to another story. One more chapter, one more gentle unfolding. The lights remain low, and the fire still crackles somewhere just beyond the words. Chapter 12. The patient who believed his parents were imposters. In the long and wandering corridors of psychiatry, there are few phenomena as quietly unsettling as what is known as Capgras delusion, a rare condition in which a person becomes convinced that someone close to them, usually a spouse or parent, has been replaced by an identical imposter. It does not announce itself with chaos. There are no flashing lights or dramatic episodes. It comes quietly and stays. The most well-known case was recorded in the early 20th century by French psychiatrists Joseph Capgras and Jean Rebou-Lachaud. Their patient was a woman named Madame M, who claimed that her husband and children had been replaced by doubles. She believed these doubles were actors or lookalikes, part of a cruel and shifting conspiracy. And though she acknowledged they looked identical to her family, she was certain, utterly, painfully certain, that they were not them. She recognized their faces, their voices, their mannerisms, but something was missing. Today, this condition bears her psychiatrist's name, Capgras delusion, and while rare, it has appeared in enough variations to suggest something deep and strange about the way our minds recognize those we love. One of the more poignant modern cases involved a man who, after a minor car accident and brief coma, awoke convinced that his mother had been replaced. He looked at her, saw her clearly, but claimed, "She looks like my mother, but she isn't. She's someone else." She cried. He did not. When shown pictures of her from earlier years, he smiled with recognition. "That's my mum," he said. But when she stood before him, living, breathing, tearful, he turned away. Doctors ran scans. Nothing obviously broken. No dramatic trauma. But the explanation, they suspected, lay deeper. To understand Capgras, one must begin with the dual process theory of recognition. When we see someone we know, two systems activate in the brain. One handles the visual recognition, yes, this is my mother's face, while the other provides emotional confirmation. Yes, and I feel what I always feel when I see her. In Capgras, it seems, these systems become disconnected. The face is recognized visually, but the emotional resonance is gone. And in that absence, the mind creates a story to explain the gap. She looks like her, but I feel nothing. Therefore, she must not be real. It is not paranoia in the usual sense. There is no fear of harm, no belief that the imposter wants to cause pain. Just a quiet, persistent conviction that something fundamental is missing. It is not just humans either. Some patients develop Capgras-like delusions about their pets, their homes, their belongings. A favorite chair might suddenly feel unfamiliar. A beloved dog, once cherished, becomes a stranger. In one case, a man began to believe that his house, though visually unchanged, was not his house at all, but an exact replica. He insisted he had been moved, that the windows were too clean, that the sound of the faucet was slightly wrong. No amount of logic could shake the belief. Even stranger, the delusion often exists only when the person is physically present. If the same patient receives a phone call from the imposter, they recognize the voice, feel the emotional response, and accept the person as genuine. It is only the visual presence that triggers the split. This peculiar detail suggests that Capgras is not about distrust or suspicion, but about disconnection, a break between seeing and feeling. And in that break, the mind, ever creative, fills the void with narrative. The condition has appeared in patients with schizophrenia, traumatic brain injury, dementia, and post-ictal psychosis. Its causes vary, but the emotional impact is often similar. Patients live in a world that is familiar but hollow, populated by replicas. They become actors in a play where the cast has been replaced. For the people around them, it is devastating. Imagine being told by your child, your partner, your parent, you are not you. Imagine being stared at with recognition in the eyes, but rejection in the voice. Imagine that you remain calm, loving, trying to explain, but the person you love turns away, convinced you are a lie. The pain cuts both ways, because many patients, even as they reject those around them, feel confusion, guilt, a strange, low-grade grief. They cannot explain why their hearts no longer respond the way they once did. They know something is wrong, but not what. And they carry this awareness like a loose thread, never enough to unravel the delusion, but always enough to tangle. In therapy, progress is slow. Some patients recover spontaneously. Others require medication or careful environmental changes. There is no guaranteed cure, just the steady, patient work of rebuilding the link between sight and sentiment. Some families choose to adapt. One woman, whose father no longer recognized her in person but did on the phone, began leaving voicemails for him every morning. He would listen to them like letters from a beloved stranger. It helped. A little. There is something deeply human in Capgras, something universal, even if its form is rare. We all at times look at the familiar and feel a strange distance, A home can feel alien. A friend's voice can sound off. We call it mood or fatigue or déjà vu. But perhaps it is the same machinery, trembling ever so slightly. Recognition, after all, is not just about seeing. It is about feeling seen in return. Capgras reminds us that love, memory, and perception are not isolated functions. They are stitched together in the quiet architecture of the mind.
Thank you for falling asleep with Sleep Library. If you'd like more quiet stories like this, you're warmly invited to subscribe, and we always love seeing your comments, even the half asleep ones. Until next time, rest well.